So yes, indeed, I've been a science publisher for most of my career. I started out as a scientist, but already then it was very difficult to, make a career in science. I think that hasn't really changed. And I worked on a ship on the oceans, and I was doing some editing work there. And at one point, from the editing work I did on that ship, I then moved into full-time publishing. Anyway, I'm going to talk about peer review because peer review is seen as the crux of science communication, the way we know it today. Peer review. There's been a lot that's been written about it recently, and if you see the headlines, you might be forgiven for getting the impression that peer review is really not much more than an elaborate system of keeping proper scientific discussion at a distance, right? Now, I will have to explain that, I suppose, and I will. The first thing that I came across when I looked into this a little bit deeper is that there are quite a number of people who think that peer review is not really useful for deciding whether research is good or not. This is a strong statement. Research is, validating research by peer review is bunk. But I understand the sentiment. But what is peer review actually? There aren't necessarily very clear definitions of what peer review is. And of course, it's different things for different purposes. If you do peer review for the purpose of grants, it's very different from peer review for the decision to publish yes or no. But what we are talking about now is indeed peer review for the decision to publish. Now, one victim, I suppose, of peer review phrased it like this, that, well, you can read for yourself, I suppose. This is pretty damning, isn't it? And I don't think it is necessarily like that. So there was a recent cartoon about, peer review. It's been streamlined and looks like this. This also gives an idea. And this is a wrong picture as well. The picture is wrong not because these people all have swords and clubs to hammer the author with, but the picture is wrong for this reason. These people are not anonymous. And in real peer review, they often are. But it may not be that bad in reality. On the other hand, I have a statement here from Richard Horton. Richard Horton is the editor of The Lancet. That's one of the top journals, I think you could say. And certainly in medicine, it's one of the top journals, if not the top journal. And he's the editor there, and he uses peer review all the time, and yet he says this. It's biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, etc., frequently wrong. Now you think this is the editor of one of the main journals. How does he decide, what to publish? He struggles with it, clearly, and I think an example we may see in the fact that, do you know about Andrew Wakefield's paper? This was a paper he published in The Lancet. Where he demonstrated an association of vaccination for measles, mumps and rubella, and then subsequently autism, which turned out, of course, later to be complete nonsense. But it was published in The Lancet, and it was published on the basis of the peer review reports that Richard Horton, as an editor, received. So maybe that's why he developed this thought that it's not necessarily so good, this peer review idea. But in the context of a journal, you get the feeling that peer review is not really about the quality of the content, but the scientific quality of the content, but perhaps a bit more about is it worth publishing in my journal? And when it is that, then of course it may mean, is it worth publishing in my journal? What does it do for my impact factor? So I think that should be complemented by the question, is peer review really good for science? Now, I was in a meeting at the Royal Society in London, and I was talking about peer review, and I used this phrase, does peer review really benefit science? And then I thought, well, yes, it does. And maybe it benefits other journals as well. It wasn't meant to be a joke, but it turned out that people took it as a joke. But basically, journals, they say they choose on quality, but it really means, you know, what does it do for my impact factor, for my prestige, and so on. So at that meeting, there was another person from publishing who is very well known, at least in circles that I normally go around in, and that is Richard Smith. He used to be the editor of the British Medical Journal, and he said, just to that august gathering there at the Royal Society, he said, slay the peer review sacred cow. He doesn't want anything to do with peer review, and he motivates that by saying his experience as the editor of the British Medical Journal showed that peer review was really no better, possibly worse, than just accepting articles that, you know, on the face of it look good. We don't need peer review, just publish everything. Although he has also been a bit milder later on, and he said, well, maybe we should have a light form of peer review so that the absolute crack pottery is taken out of it, and we just publish the stuff that at least seems reasonable. And then let the entire community form an opinion on, you know, is it good or not? How did peer review arise? Well, originally, of course, when we are talking a few hundred years ago, it was very much, science communication was very much a handwritten thing, letters and so on. And how do you copy them and then send them out to reviewers? That was very laborious and wasn't done. The editors read the letter and thought, well, this is interesting, so we'll publish it. But of course, a number of developments made it a bit easier to ask others. Such as, you know, when manuscripts started to be typed, and then authors were asked to provide a couple of copies, carbon copies. The photocopier, of course, did a great deal in that regard. Obviously, the computer and the word processor did even more, and the way we communicate nowadays via the internet made it very easy to ask people for their opinions and send them a manuscript and so on. But one thing we should bear in mind, that peer review, even though it is now, you know, the mainstay of scientific communication, is really not that old. Of course, sometimes even in the deep past, people were asked to have a second opinion and so on, but systematic peer review, before things were published, really dates only from the late 1960s. And you may be surprised that Nature only started peer review in the early 1970s. I think it was 1973. So it really is, although maybe some of you weren't born then yet, but to me it sounds as very recent. To illustrate that a little bit, Einstein, you have more than 300 papers, and only one of those was sent out for peer review. They were just published because, possibly because the editors thought it was good stuff, possibly because the guy was called Einstein, and after his first few papers, people thought, well, you know, we are not going to refuse Einstein. And when he was, that one paper that was reviewed was refused, by the way. So Einstein doesn't like it. And he wrote to the editor, to the journal, and he said, well, you know, we sent this manuscript for publication. We didn't send it to be sent out to be commented on by some stranger. some anonymous expert who doesn't know what he's talking about. Transpired later, of course, that the anonymous expert was right, and so Einstein didn't publish this paper again. But he called it an unhappy incident, and he never published with Physical Reviews again. So let's arrive at the current way peer review is done. And I've listed a few characteristics, not trying to be totally comprehensive, but a fair overview of what the things are. So it's slow, it's expensive, it's unreliable, it's highly variable, it's ineffective, arbitrary, inefficient, it undermines scientific skepticism, it is, there's an enormous confirmation bias, and it is putting careerism, jobs, before science. Okay, I'll go through each of them. Slow, and I do that with a quote that I found for each of them. It is slow, and the best illustration of that is that if somebody sees it's only done, it takes only 8 weeks, that they are so surprised that it can be done in only 8 weeks. In some areas it takes a year. Certainly half a year is quite normal. Peer review on the whole is slow, although there are a few journals that really try hard to do it fast. But of course you can understand why it is slow. If you're invited as a peer reviewer, you take your time. It doesn't necessarily come on a day that the invitation doesn't necessarily come on a day when you have absolutely nothing else to do. Let's face it. It's expensive, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more later. I'd like to go through the other things first. It's unreliable in the sense that it's not a measure of truth of what is published. And the incentives are not there to make it that either. Things may be untrue, and more often than not are. The percentage of papers that could be replicated is appallingly low. I think there was recently a study done, and they came to the conclusion that in a few medical fields, the papers that could be replicated, the experiments that could be replicated were less than a third of the total published, which is really damning, isn't it? It's also highly variable. Reviewers rarely agree with one another. You would think that if it's an objective mechanism that they would, roughly agree on the whole, agree to reject or agree to accept. But there's a very large number of papers where, the reviewers, if there's two, the reviewers actually disagree with one another. There's been a paper recently in, where was it, in PLOS One, where what they call the inter-rater reliability, to what degree do the reviewers agree, has been shown to be very, very low. And even if they agree, they sometimes agree on the wrong thing. I'll give you an example. There was an economist who wrote an article, "The Market for Lemons." In principle, it's quite a nice short title, and it was dismissed. It was submitted and rejected as trivial. And then it was submitted to another journal, rejected again, submitted to another journal, and now this is wrong, we don't want to do this, there's something wrong with the reasoning. On the basis of that paper, a few years later, the guy got a Nobel Prize. So the reviewers were plainly wrong. This I've already said. It's ineffective. Ineffective in picking out wrong practices or even fraud. There's a fair amount of fraud. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, and fraud is not necessarily the blatant fraud where all the data are made up, but fraud is also leaving out data points that seem a bit out of line with what your theory says, right? and yet they could be very important. But if you leave them out, they have a nice regression line and so on. It's not disturbed by outliers. That is a kind of misconduct that, I'm afraid, is more widespread than we all care to admit. It's arbitrary. Just think of it, an article that's submitted and possibly done by, written by, a large number of authors, is then put before two peer reviewers. Pretty random, in a sense. So this example shows you that even the same article that was rejected or accepted earlier is then by the same people in the same journal, when resubmitted under a different name, gets a different verdict. Well, that is pretty damning too, in my view. And then it's inefficient. I use the analogy of a cascade. So you submit it to a journal, it gets rejected, so then you submit it to another journal, it gets rejected, so then you submit it to another journal, it gets rejected, and then finally it's published. Just about everything is published. Just about, and of course that doesn't mean published completely unchanged. Very often in the process, changes are made and improvements are made, but it's not a way to keep out certain papers out of the literature. It's just that they go down a pecking order on the whole, although there are examples of papers that when they were rejected were submitted to a journal higher in the pecking order and accepted. Gives another idea of how reliable the system is. A more serious, well, no, they're all serious. A very serious point is also that it seems to undermine a natural scientific skepticism that scientists, researchers should have. Not just researchers, also journalists, science journalists. And it almost comes with a guarantee. Like, this is peer-reviewed means to a lot of people, this is true, this is valid. And that is a big mistake. I think you can't do that. Certainly as a scientist you can't do it. I don't think you can do that even as a journalist. And I'm quoting here Peter Burks. He's from the University of Oxford and he also has a seat in Leiden in the Netherlands. And he says, doubt should be written in a scientist's DNA, whatever the peer review that has been done. And I agree with that. I can point to a peer review report that I once saw. This was in an article by Alan Singleton. He's the editor of a journal, Learned Publishing. He's a physicist, and he pointed this out to me. A peer review report that says, well, I don't really believe it, but I can't really find enough fault with it to reject it, so I think it should be put before the whole community, and it should be discussed, and the whole community should look at it. It should be published, therefore, even though I don't know whether it's true or not, and I have my doubts. And I think that is just not done often enough. And as a result of which, peer review has this aura of this is right. It's not even a new idea, because there was in the beginning of the 20th century, Oliver Lodge had basically the same sort of thing. Well, this is bad, it looks bad, but it's almost certainly incorrect even, he said, but put it in the journal and let the community judge that, decide that. The falsely reassuring label that peer review is, or is seen to be, is simply wrong. It doesn't give you more assurance than your own judgment very often. On to confirmation bias. People have a natural tendency, it's only human, to see the things that confirm their theories and to ignore the ones that don't. And, but of course, this is really not proper science. And this thing I've quoted from an article from 1977. but, and that's why I used old-fashioned fonts here, but Francis Bacon already identified this as a problem, centuries ago, 3 centuries ago. Another problem with the confirmation bias is that negative results, however valid they are, negative results are not published to the degree necessary. If you do an experiment and you find out it doesn't work, this thing doesn't work, then I think it's very important to tell all your colleagues around the world about that. And yet, for journals, it's not so interesting because it doesn't improve their impact factor. And so they have a high tendency of saying no to those articles. And the statistics show that in the last decades, the number of negative papers that have been published has actually gone down quite dramatically. And then something that is important to many of you, I suppose. Publish or perish, you have to do it. Competition for jobs is very severe. And yeah, there is a problem with that. Because you have to publish, you try to portray whatever you've done in the best possible way. And The Economist devoted an article to it recently. And the whole idea, and I mentioned that earlier, the verification of it, replication of it, shows that a lot of stuff is published that really shouldn't be published. It could deceive, it could mislead. So where do we go from here? First of all, peer review is an academic exercise. I think we have to recognize it. It's an academic, it's not a publishing exercise. It's an academic exercise. It's academicians who do it. It's researchers who do it. And only the organization of it, the administration of it, is done by publishers. Now that becomes a very important thing later on. Because publishers, they very gratefully accept that role, of course, because it literally looks like them, that the scientific community is just throwing money at them and they just pick it up. Wouldn't you? So they face a lot of criticism from academia, but it's unwarranted. The publishers are not the ones that create the dysfunctional system. They are the ones that react to it. And they see the money being thrown at them, so yeah, they know what to do. They're business people. And I think it's wrong to blame them for it. If you want to throw money at them, then it's your fault, it's not their fault. So academia has to get a grip, and I have a word for it. I call the academic ecosystem is often an ego system. You appreciate the difference. A metricultural, and by metricultural I mean it's completely bowled over by metrics. So if it can be measured, like impact factors, like citations, like alt metrics these days, the metrics seem to be worth more than the scientific relevance or scientific importance of publications, and that's a bad thing. And a consequence of giving the publishers such an important role in the science communication is that it does make peer review publishing very, very expensive. And I mean expensive. I mean billions of dollars every year, billions of euros. The same thing, billions. It's very expensive. And it is very expensive because the peer review is outsourced to publishers. It's not the peer review itself, because you as scientists do that, and you do it mostly without getting any money for it. There are some rare examples where a token payment is paid, but most of the time peer reviewers do it for free. So here we are onto expense. The publishing industry is based on essentially the old print model, which really hasn't moved with the times, and the environment has changed so enormously. In the internet world, we can do things much better, and yet it doesn't seem to happen yet. So this is a guy called Steve Pettifer. He's a scientist at the University of Manchester, and I know him personally quite well. And he said, really, the cost of traditional publishing is totally out of kilter with the claimed added value. That added value was there in the time of print. You know, print is very expensive, it has to be distributed and so on. But what happens now, with all the possibilities of the internet, we're really talking about a print analog. And that is just not good enough. So how far out of kilter is it? Now this seems a very bold statement. 98 to 99% of the cost to academia of publishing is basically down to peer review being done by publishers. Now, I have to back that up with some calculation, don't I? So I will. Do you know the Scholarly Kitchen blog? That's a blog called the Scholarly Kitchen, and that is basically from or by publishers for publishers. It's quite a widely read blog in the publishing world. I don't know if many scientists actually read it, but and they had a calculation the other day. They were complaining. They were complaining about PubMed Central, and they said they're wasting all our taxpayers' money. They spend on technical preparation of an article an average of $47. $47 an article. On proper XML, etc., proper hosting, $47 an article. That's an enormous amount, isn't it? But it means that the cost of all the other things a publisher does is quite a bit more. Because the average article processing charge of a so-called hybrid journal, a journal that has traditional articles that are not open and a number of open access articles. The open access articles in there cost an average of $3,000. So deduct the $47 it takes to do the technical preparation, and you come with an amount of, well, basically almost $3,000. Which is spent on organization, not the peer review itself, the organization of peer review. You can do a lot of organization for that. And it's worse when you talk about the subscription journals that have an average, worldwide average of in the order of $5,000. So it's even further out of kilter. Now, of course, these amounts include things like overhead and profits and very importantly, it also includes the articles that are not published, because the peer review still has to be organized for those. So if you have a journal and you reject 95%, then those 5% of articles have to carry the cost of the peer review for all the others. So these numbers are exaggerated, I'll come back to that later. But the current system impedes scientific communication. It makes scientific communication slower to start with, and it doesn't really do justice to all the papers that should be published. 5 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. Yeah, I can do it, 10 minutes. And funnily, we seem to prefer it in that way. We here is the scientific community worldwide. We keep propping up the system at a vast expense. But it really has, the peer review, the way it's done now, really has illusionary benefits. What is not illusionary, this is illusionary benefits for science. What's not illusionary is the benefits it has for career advancement. You really need, to show off your best work if you want to make career moves. But why are they combined? Why are they combined? Why do we, for the sake of career movement, impede the scientific communication when it is the science itself? So, I think what peer review for publication should be is basically reviewers helping the authors to avoid unnecessary errors. It could be done quite easily. Well, look, if you have these things, your statistics are not quite right. Work on that a little bit because this gives the wrong impression and it's not right. So, help them improve their papers. That helps improve the communication. Help improve the clarity of the papers, because sometimes scientists are, they have turns of phrase that are not necessarily understood by everyone. So, of course, that's my opinion. I use one German phrase in here. It's all meiner Meinung gemäß. Unfortunately, my German is not good enough to do the whole thing in German, but never mind. That is the most constructive role of peer review that I can think of. Even if it's just due to the second reading effect, somebody else looks at it and so on. So I have a proposal, and the proposal is to separate the two. Separate the communication on the one hand and the assessment for career purposes or quality purposes on the other hand. So, and then subsequently, when you separate them, involve the publishers just in the publication of it, not in the peer review. Peer review should be left to academia, purely to academia. And even though I said earlier that, in the scholarly blog they were talking about $47, I think it is in reality a bit more, because I don't think I could do it for $47. I wouldn't know how. But I would know how to do it for a few $100s, like $200, $300, maybe. Okay, let's round it up, $500. That's still 1/10 of the amount now paid by academia. And how could it work? Well, you could, for instance, pre-publish. Put your articles, your manuscript in a preprint. It's called Preprint Repository. Preprint is a bit kind of 1950s, but still. The two, I've named two here, but there may be a few more. These are the two most prominent, and of course, the most well-known and the oldest already. Well, archive is pretty old. What you do is you put your stuff in archive, and then subsequently you submit it to a journal for approbation, for the badge of this is quality, and so on. Bioarchive is a similar idea in the life sciences. And then you publish it in journals after that, for the stratification of the quality and so on. So this is how it could work, but it doesn't make it cheaper, because you still have to go to the journals for this approbation, for this badge of quality. So how could it be done and be less expensive? Well, in my view, this is a valid way of looking at it. Just as an author asked at least two experts what they think of it, and could they help making it, better at all, and could they support or endorse publication? And of course, you have to have a few things there. You can't have your best friend doing it. You can't have your colleague or your father do it, or your mother. You have to have some rules as to who would really be, could really be seen as an expert. And the other thing is, you would do it openly, so that nepotism and that sort of thing are really given very little chance. You would not endorse a paper that's rubbish if your own reputation would suffer as a result. So openness is very important in that idea. And then the costs then would really come down because there's no wastage in the system either, because if an article is then deemed to be worthy of publication, or throwing it in front of the rest of the scientific community, you don't have to reject anything. So every article carries the costs of publishing. So it could be an awful lot lower than what it is now. There is a cost, because let's be honest, manuscripts are very often pretty messy. Even the best ones, there are often technical issues. The XML is not right, or the figures need brushing up and what have you. So there is a cost to it, but the cost is nowhere near $5,000 an article. And in my estimate, it's more in the order of 300 to 400. I mentioned that before. And I call this system peer review by endorsement. And I've been going around publishers, would they do this? And so some were very friendly and offered me a drink and said no. And so finally there was one that said, yeah, I think it's worth trying. So I'm very pleased with that. First I want to draw attention to the fact that the idea I thought it was an original idea, and then I found out, well, others have, of course, also had the same ideas. Unfortunately, these people, they published something similar, but in a paywalled journal. And because I'm a poor retired person, I don't have access to all the literature, so I never saw this. And I couldn't. So I tried to look it up, but of course, access denied. So I have an excuse here. And of course there's this question, okay, if you do it like that, what about quality? Well, what about quality? First of all, can we define quality? Impact factor? Citation count? No. You know what gives you the best way to get a high citation count is shorter titles. Shorter titles are cited more. So here's a suggestion for you. Make it as short as possible, and then the chances of being cited are increased dramatically. Because another thing is the journal reputation, of course, is not the same as the quality of an individual article. The spread, even in science, is enormous. Some articles are, cited a few hundred times, and other articles just 10 times. And they don't hover around the impact factor of, what is it, 40 or so at the moment. If they did, then it would be okay, but they don't. There's an enormous spread, and some people are saying, well, publish that spread, because at least then we have a better idea. And of course, also, the article quality is not necessarily the researcher quality, because how many articles are there with one author? Not many. Mostly it's more. I mentioned the variable citation count. But if you have an article with 5 authors, how are you apportioning the... Are they all equally excellent? Well, hopefully they are, but reality, let's face it, there are a few authors in there. If you have a group, who should get the bulk of the credit? I don't know. I think it's very dangerous to say the impact factor of an article is a measure for the quality of the authors. Maybe for one of them, if it's a single author, but not for multiple authors. So the peer review system via journals is just not suitable for assessing the quality. That doesn't say that there is no hint that the published paper can give, but it's really no more than a hint. I'm very pleased to announce that literally 30 minutes ago, the first article on this experimental model of peer review by endorsement has been published by a German publisher, a small German publisher, Science Open. And this link is to the way they define that. And this is the article. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a short title, but it's open. And this is the actual web page where you can. Now I will leave behind the slides, And maybe via the library you can get a copy if you wish, or maybe you can even put them up online and so on. So then you can follow. I thank you very much for your attention, and I have a slide with all the links, so you could follow them up if later you should want to do that. And the floor is open for questions, I would say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.